The Soviet Union was built on a vision of the new man, rational, disciplined, productive, and entirely devoted to the construction of socialism. But beneath the propaganda posters and the triumphant speeches, beneath the factory floors and the collective farms, there lurked a problem so deep, so pervasive, and so resistant to change that it would outlast every general secretary, every five-year plan, and ultimately the Soviet state itself. That problem was alcohol, and the story of how the USSR tried and failed to defeat it is a story of ideology colliding with reality, of good intentions crushed by economic necessity, and of a culture so deeply intertwined with drinking that even the most powerful totalitarian apparatus in history could not tear them apart. The relationship between Russians and alcohol predates the Soviet Union by centuries. Vodka had been woven into the fabric of Russian life since at least the 15th century, serving as social lubricant, painkiller, celebration ritual, and escape from the grinding hardships of peasant existence. The Tsars understood this well. They monopolized vodka production not out of concern for public health, but because alcohol taxation provided anywhere from 25 to 40% of state revenues in the decades before the revolution. When Russians drank, the state treasury filled. This was a bargain the imperial government accepted without hesitation, even as doctors, writers, and reformers warned of the social devastation alcohol was causing across the empire. When the Bolsheviks seized power in October 1917, they inherited this legacy but claimed they would transform it. Lenin and his comrades viewed alcoholism as a disease of capitalism, a symptom of exploitation and despair that would naturally wither away once the workers controlled the means of production. In the early years after the revolution, the Soviet government maintained the prohibition that had been introduced by Tsar Nicholas II at the start of World War I in 1914. This wartime measure had been intended to keep soldiers sober and workers productive, and the Bolsheviks initially saw value in continuing it. They launched campaigns against drunkenness, portraying alcohol as a tool the bourgeoisie had used to keep the proletariat docile and unthinking. Posters from the early 1920s show workers smashing bottles, choosing books over vodka, and rejecting the tavern for the library. But ideology quickly gave way to economic reality. The Soviet state was desperate for revenue. The Civil War had devastated the economy, foreign powers were hostile, and the new government needed cash to survive. In 1923, the Soviet leadership made a decision that would haunt the country for the next 7 decades. They legalized the sale of vodka again. The justification was straightforward and brutally pragmatic. If people were going to drink anyway, and they were often consuming dangerous homemade spirits, then the state might as well profit from it and at least ensure some quality control. The reintroduction of state-produced vodka in 1925, initially at lower alcohol content, but soon returning to the traditional 40%, opened the floodgates. By 1927, vodka sales were generating substantial revenue for the state budget, and the Soviet government found itself in exactly the same position as the Tsars, addicted not to alcohol itself, but to the money it generated. Stalin's rise to power and the forced industrialization and collectivization drives of the late 1920s and 1930s made the alcohol problem worse, not better. The breakneck pace of industrial construction, the brutal uprooting of millions of peasants, the constant shortages, the fear of the secret police, and the grinding poverty created exactly the conditions in which people seek escape through drinking. Workers in the new industrial cities lived in overcrowded barracks, worked punishing hours in dangerous conditions, and had little access to entertainment or comfort. Vodka was cheap, available, and effective. The state needed these workers to be productive, but it also needed the revenue from vodka sales. The contradiction was obvious but unresolved. During World War II, alcohol played a complex role. The Red Army famously issued a daily ration of vodka to frontline troops, the so-called People's Commissar of Defense 100 grams, introduced in 1941. This was justified as a way to boost morale, dull fear, and help soldiers endure the unimaginable horrors of the Eastern Front. Whether it actually improved combat effectiveness or simply made the nightmare more bearable is debatable. But the policy embedded drinking even more deeply into Soviet masculine culture. To be a soldier, to be a hero, to endure suffering, all of this became associated with the ability to drink. After the war, the Soviet Union faced massive reconstruction challenges. Millions of men returned from the front traumatized, cities lay in ruins, and the population was exhausted. Alcohol consumption rose steadily throughout the late 1940s and 1950s. Khrushchev, who came to power after Stalin's death in 1953, was aware of the problem. He launched campaigns encouraging moderation and promoting beer and wine as alternatives to hard liquor, hoping that if people drank beverages with lower alcohol content, they would consume less overall. This strategy failed almost immediately. Russians simply drank more beer and wine to achieve the same effect, or they continued drinking vodka, as they always had. Khrushchev's government also tried to reduce the number of liquor stores and restrict sales hours. But these measures only created long lines and a thriving black market. The scale of the problem by the 1960s was staggering. The Soviet Union had one of the highest rates of alcohol consumption per capita in the world. Official statistics, which almost certainly understated the reality, showed that the average Soviet citizen consumed around 8 to 10 liters of pure alcohol per year in the mid-60s, but when illegal home production and unregistered consumption were factored in, the real figure was likely much higher, possibly 15 liters or more. This was not social drinking. This was systematic, heavy drinking that destroyed families, killed workers, and drained economic productivity. Absenteeism due to alcohol was endemic. Mondays were notorious for low productivity as workers recovered from weekend binges. Industrial accidents often involved intoxicated workers. Domestic violence, child neglect, and family breakdown were directly linked to alcoholism in countless homes across the Soviet Union. The Brezhnev era, from 1964 to 1982, saw the problem reach crisis levels. Brezhnev himself was known to enjoy drinking, and his government's approach to alcoholism was characterized by half-hearted measures and bureaucratic inertia. There were campaigns, of course. There were always campaigns. Posters urged moderation, doctors warned of health consequences, and the Komsomol organized anti-alcohol events. But none of this addressed the fundamental issues. Vodka remained cheap and universally available. The state continued to depend on alcohol revenues, which, by the 1970s, accounted for roughly 12 to 15% of the entire state budget. To seriously restrict alcohol sales would blow a massive hole in government finances. To raise prices significantly would risk social unrest. So the state did neither. It continued to produce and sell vodka in enormous quantities while simultaneously condemning those who drank too much. The social costs were catastrophic. Male life expectancy in the Soviet Union, which had been rising steadily in the post-war decades, began to stagnate in the late 1960s, and then actually started to decline in the 1970s, a phenomenon almost unprecedented in peacetime for an industrialized nation. By the early 1980s, male life expectancy had fallen to around 62 years, comparable to much poorer developing countries. Alcohol was not the only factor. Poor health care, industrial pollution, smoking, and cardiovascular disease all played roles. But researchers estimated that alcohol-related deaths, both direct and indirect, accounted for a substantial portion of this mortality crisis. Men were dying from acute alcohol poisoning, from accidents while drunk, from alcohol-related diseases like cirrhosis and pancreatitis, and from violence associated with drinking. The economic impact was equally severe. The Soviet economy in the 1970s and early 80s was already struggling with stagnation, inefficiency, and technological backwardness. Alcohol made everything worse. Productivity losses from absenteeism, accidents, and workers showing up drunk or hungover were enormous. One Soviet study estimated that alcohol-related problems cost the economy tens of billions of rubles annually in lost production, medical expenses, and law enforcement costs. The state was essentially cannibalizing itself, profiting from vodka sales in the short term while destroying the health and productivity of its workforce in the long term. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in March 1985, he was acutely aware of the alcohol crisis. He was younger than his predecessors, more energetic, and genuinely committed to reforming the Soviet system. He believed that without addressing alcoholism, his broader plans for economic restructuring and modernization would fail. Workers could not become more productive if they were drunk. Society could not modernize if families were being destroyed by alcohol. Within weeks of taking office, Gorbachev began planning the most ambitious and comprehensive anti-alcohol campaign in Soviet history. The campaign was launched in May 1985 with a decree titled "On Measures to Overcome Drunkenness and Alcoholism." It was sweeping in scope. The state drastically reduced the number of stores selling alcohol, cut production of vodka and other spirits, raised prices significantly, restricted sales hours to between 2 and 7 in the evening, banned alcohol sales near factories, schools, and hospitals, increased penalties for public drunkenness and drinking on the job, and launched a massive propaganda effort. Vineyards were destroyed to reduce wine production. Distilleries were closed or converted to other purposes. The legal drinking age was raised from 18 to 21. Weddings, traditionally alcohol-soaked affairs, were encouraged to be dry. The state promoted fruit juices and soft drinks as alternatives. Gorbachev himself was photographed drinking mineral water and fruit juice, setting an example from the top. The campaign was serious, systematic, and backed by the full power of the state. For a brief period, it appeared to work. Alcohol consumption dropped sharply. Official statistics showed that vodka sales fell by more than half between 1984 and 1987. Public drunkenness became less visible, so industrial accident rates declined. There were even signs that male life expectancy, which had been falling for years, began to tick upward slightly in 1986 and 1987. Some Soviet citizens, particularly women who had long suffered from their husbands' drinking, welcomed the campaign enthusiastically. But the backlash was swift and severe. The campaign was deeply unpopular with large segments of the population, especially men. Long lines formed outside liquor stores before the restricted sales hours. People hoarded vodka, treating bottles as currency. The black market exploded. Home production of moonshine, known as samagon, surged to levels not seen since the early Soviet years. People brewed alcohol from anything they could find: sugar, potatoes, fruit, even industrial products. There were reports of people drinking cologne, aftershave, window cleaner, and other substances containing alcohol, leading to a spike in poisonings and deaths. The state's attempt to control alcohol consumption had simply driven it underground, making it more dangerous and less regulated. The economic consequences were also disastrous. The state lost billions of rubles in revenue from reduced vodka sales at exactly the moment when Gorbachev's government desperately needed money to fund his reform programs. The budget deficit widened. The destruction of vineyards, particularly in Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova, angered local populations and damaged regional economies. Sugar, which people were using to make moonshine, disappeared from stores, causing shortages and further public resentment. The campaign became a symbol of state overreach and the disconnect between the leadership and ordinary people. Politically, the anti-alcohol campaign damaged Gorbachev's standing. He became known sarcastically as the mineral water secretary. The campaign was seen as puritanical, unrealistic, and hypocritical, especially when it became clear that party elites and those with connections could still obtain alcohol easily. By 1987, less than 2 years into the campaign, the government began quietly scaling back the restrictions. Sales hours were extended, production was increased, and enforcement became less strict. By 1988, the campaign was effectively over, though it was never officially abandoned. Gorbachev later admitted that while the campaign had some positive effects, it had been too radical, too fast, and had failed to address the underlying social and cultural factors that drove drinking. The failure of Gorbachev's anti-alcohol campaign was not just a policy failure. It was a demonstration of the limits of state power even in a totalitarian system. The Soviet government could command armies, build nuclear weapons, launch satellites, and control the press, but it could not make its citizens stop drinking. The reasons for this failure were multiple and deeply rooted. Alcohol was not just a habit in Soviet society. It was a coping mechanism for dealing with a system that was often arbitrary, oppressive, and hopeless. It was a social glue that bound men together in a culture where emotional expression was discouraged and genuine community was difficult to build under constant state surveillance. It was a form of rebellion, a way to assert personal autonomy in a society that sought to control every aspect of life. Moreover, the state itself was complicit. For decades, the Soviet government had profited enormously from alcohol sales while doing little to address the underlying causes of alcoholism: poverty, poor living conditions, lack of opportunity, psychological trauma, and social alienation. The state had created a dependent population and then blamed individuals for their dependency. The anti-alcohol campaigns, whether under Khrushchev or Gorbachev, were attempts to treat symptoms while ignoring the disease. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the alcohol problem did not disappear. In fact, it got worse. The chaos and economic devastation of the 1990s, the collapse of social services, the rise of organized crime, and the profound sense of loss and humiliation felt by many Russians led to a surge in drinking. Male life expectancy, which had briefly improved during Gorbachev's campaign, plummeted in the 90s, falling to below 58 years by the mid-90s, a catastrophic decline. Alcohol was a major factor. Cheap vodka flooded the market, much of it counterfeit and dangerous. The state, desperate for revenue and lacking the capacity to regulate effectively, did little to control it. The story of the Soviet Union's battle against alcoholism is ultimately a story about the limits of social engineering and the dangers of ignoring root causes. The Soviet state could mobilize millions for war, could industrialize a backward agrarian society in a generation, and could build a superpower from the ruins of the Russian Empire, but it could not create the new Soviet man it promised. That ideal person, sober, disciplined, selfless, and devoted to the collective, remained a fantasy because the system itself created conditions that made such a person impossible. The alienation, the repression, the shortages, the fear, the lack of meaning and purpose beyond serving the state, all of these drove people to seek escape. And alcohol provided that escape. The failure was not for lack of trying. From Lenin to Gorbachev, Soviet leaders recognized the problem and attempted solutions. But every solution ran into the same contradictions. The state needed the revenue from alcohol. The population needed the relief that alcohol provided. And the cultural acceptance of heavy drinking was so deep that no amount of propaganda, restriction, or punishment could uproot it. The campaigns came and went, each one initially promising, each one ultimately ineffective. Today, Russia still struggles with alcohol. Consumption rates remain high by global standards, though they have declined somewhat from the catastrophic levels of the 1990s and early 2000s. Life expectancy has improved, partly due to government efforts to reduce alcohol consumption through higher taxes, advertising restrictions, and limits on sales hours. But the legacy of the Soviet era persists. Drinking remains deeply embedded in Russian culture, particularly among men. The social and health costs remain significant. The Soviet attempt to fight alcoholism failed because it was a battle against a symptom rather than a cure for the disease. The disease was the system itself, a system that crushed individual initiative, stifled genuine community, created economic scarcity amid propaganda of plenty, and offered little hope for a better future. Alcohol was how people survived that system. Until the system changed, the drinking would not stop. And when the system finally did collapse, the drinking continued because the trauma and dislocation of the collapse created new reasons to drink. The vodka bottle outlasted the hammer and sickle, and in that persistence lies a profound lesson about the limits of state power and the endurance of human needs that no ideology can fully suppress or satisfy.